Right, so yesterday the United Nations-backed Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, IPC, confirmed what many across the world already knew from the haunting images of skeletal children, the testimonies of desperate parents, and the repeated alerts from humanitarian agencies. Famine exists in Gaza. For the first time in the history of the IPC system, famine has been officially declared outside Africa, in a densely urban environment watched by drones and subjected to one of the most technologically advanced militaries in the world. This was no famine caused by drought or natural disaster, but the consequence of political decisions, systematic obstruction, and the deliberate use of starvation as a weapon of war. The IPC declaration, alongside the searing words of Tom Fletcher, the UN's humanitarian chief, devastated Israel's narrative of denial and placed its allies in the dock of global opinion for having enabled matters to get this bad. This famine declaration is a humanitarian alarm bell, a legal milestone, a political earthquake. It is a watershed moment where the world must now change course. It must now change course. It is inexcusable to not do so. And history will judge all who allowed it to unfold and get this bad already, but all the more so those who still don't act from this moment forward. Right, so the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, IPC, is the world's most authoritative tool for measuring food insecurity, bar none. It is the gold standard if things can be put in such a way. It emerged out of a global partnership between United Nations agencies, humanitarian organisations and governments, and has been designed precisely to provide a rigorous, scientific language to describe food crises. It avoids the vagueness of political rhetoric by using a strict 5-phase scale: minimal, stressed, crisis, emergency, and catastrophe/famine. To declare famine at the area level is no casual act in itself. 3 hard thresholds have to be crossed to reach that point. At least 20% of households must face extreme food shortages, at least 30% of children must be acutely malnourished, and mortality must surpass 2 deaths per 10,000 people per day. These requirements are so stringent that famines are very rarely ever declared, even when suffering is widespread. The intent of this is very clear, therefore. When famine is announced, the world knows, without doubt, that the thresholds of catastrophe have very much been breached. In Gaza, those thresholds are being met in devastating fashion. Over 500,000 people were already living in famine conditions by the beginning of this month, with projections of more than 600,000 by the end of September. 12,000 children were identified as acutely malnourished in July alone, with 1/4 suffering severe acute malnutrition, the deadliest form. Nearly 40% of households reported going days without eating, with parents skipping meals to give what little food they had to their children. Mortality rates in parts of Gaza City and its surrounding areas exceeded the IPC benchmark. In short, all 3 famine criteria were not only reached, but surpassed and then some. The rarity of such a declaration gives it historic weight, therefore. Since the IPC was founded, famine had only ever been confirmed in Somalia in 2011, in parts of South Sudan in 2017, in Ethiopia during the Tigray conflict, and in Yemen. These cases were all in context of drought, civil war, or systemic collapse in fragile states. Gaza's famine is unprecedented against that backdrop. A modern, urban population of over 2 million people, hemmed in by a blockade, in fertile land located just meters from food supplies that are deliberately obstructed at checkpoints. The declaration is, therefore, not merely a humanitarian statistic. It is the world's most authoritative confirmation that a preventable, man-made famine exists in 2025. For months before the IPC spoke, the world was being confronted with images that told their own truth, though. Photographs of infants with skeletal limbs and sunken eyes emerged from Gaza's overwhelmed hospitals. Aid workers and doctors reported deaths from starvation and dehydration, and hospitals issued certificates listing malnutrition as a cause of death. Parents described feeding their children weeds or animal fodder. Adults skipped meals so that their children could eat, while many families went entire days without food. These testimonies made famine visible long before it was scientifically declared. Israel nevertheless persisted with categorical denials. Benjamin Netanyahu described reports of famine as blood libel, weaponizing a historical anti-Semitic trope to dismiss the warnings, because of course he did. Officials insisted that sufficient aid was flowing, and when confronted with images of starving children, they blamed Hamas for looting supplies or obstructing distribution, despite it being very much well proven by now that the looters are actually Israeli-backed terrorist groups. Western allies repeated softer versions of the same line, calling for more evidence or suggesting that the data was inconclusive, their own eyes apparently lying to them. Aid agencies that rang alarm bells were just accused of exaggeration. Well, the IPC declaration strips this denial of all credibility now. That is how big a moment this is. What had been framed as allegation has now been converted into scientific fact. Scientific certification destroys any rhetorical wiggle room. Israel and its allies can no longer claim famine is propaganda. They could only choose between acknowledgement or willful distortion now. And I think we all know which way they'll go. The IPC will no doubt be called anti-Semitic as well, and probably Hamas at the same time. We know all of their excuses by now. The declaration exposed denial as not merely implausible, but cynical and destructive and very much intentional. If the IPC provided the diagnosis, though, Tom Fletcher's remarks delivered the moral judgment. Fletcher is the UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. He spoke about this in stark and unforgettable terms, and I couldn't possibly outdo him in this stakes.
It is a famine on all of our watch. Everyone owns this. The Gaza famine is the world's famine. It is a famine that asks, but what did you do? A famine that will and must haunt us all. Please read the IPC report, cover to cover. Read it in sorrow and in anger, not as words and numbers, but as names and lives. Be in no doubt that this is irrefutable testimony. It is a famine, the Gaza famine. It is a famine that we could have prevented if we had been allowed. Yet food stacks up at borders because of systematic obstruction by Israel. It is a famine within a few hundred meters of food in a fertile land. It is a famine in 2025, a 21st century famine, watched over by drones and the most advanced military technology in history. It is a famine that must spur the world to more urgent action, that must shame the world to do better. It is a famine that therefore also asks, and what now will you do?
It is a famine, he declared. The Gaza famine. A famine that we could have prevented if we had been allowed. Yet food stacks up at borders because of systematic obstruction by Israel. It is a famine within a few hundred meters of food in a fertile land. It is a famine openly promoted by some Israeli leaders as a weapon of war. It is a famine caused by cruelty, justified by revenge, enabled by indifference, sustained by complicity. These are damning words that should chill every world leader to the bone, especially if they're the sort that are still kissing Netanyahu's backside. That speech went viral because it broke from the careful and technocratic style that often characterizes UN pronouncements. Fletcher named Israel's obstruction directly. His emotions were clearly on show. He described famine not as misfortune, but as intentional policy. And crucially, he widened that circle of responsibility. This was not only Israel's famine, but the world's famine, a stain that implicated every government and institution that has allowed it to happen. It is a famine on all of our watch, he said, a famine that asks, what did you do? The moral power of this challenge needs to resonate with everyone globally. Broadcast widely, shared millions of times already on social media, Fletcher's words galvanized outrage and underscored the urgency of accountability. In contrast to Israel's increasingly shrill denials, the speech gave voice to a global consensus that starvation has been deliberately allowed and that silence has amounted to complicity. The deed is done. The famine in Gaza illustrates the brutal clarity of cause and effect, therefore. Israel's blockade and systematic obstruction of humanitarian aid were the cause. The IPC's famine declaration, the collapse of Israel's denials, the surge of global outrage are the effect. One flowed inexorably from the other. What Israel attempted to deny and deflect has now come back upon it as irrefutable evidence of their culpability. The Famine Declaration intensifies Israel's legal jeopardy as well. Under their own statute of the International Criminal Court, intentionally starving civilians as a method of warfare is, surprise, surprise, you'll be shocked to hear, a war crime. The IPC's official famine finding now bolsters the ICC's case immeasurably. The charges rest not on contested claims, but on a UN-backed scientific assessment now. The International Court of Justice is also directly affected in similar manner. South Africa's case alleging genocide by Israel hinges partly on whether the state has imposed conditions of life intended to bring about the destruction of a people. Starvation is amongst the clearest such conditions. The IPC declaration provides the evidentiary link between policy and consequence thereto. Legal scholars already argue that Israel's blockade of Gaza, coupled with restrictions on humanitarian access, fits the definition of genocidal starvation. This declaration makes that argument far, far stronger now. Universal jurisdiction adds another layer. Belgian authorities arrested Israeli soldiers in July on war crimes grounds, didn't they? Citing indiscriminate attacks and starvation tactics. Spain, Ireland, other states have legal frameworks that allow them to prosecute war crimes regardless of where they occurred. The IPC famine finding gives them the evidentiary foundation to act against Israeli officials as well who travel abroad. The legal consequences therefore extend well beyond Israel's leaders to any official potentially implicated in the blockade now. Nor are consequences confined to Israel alone. States and corporations that knowingly supply weapons, financing or political cover to a government enforcing famine risk being accused of aiding and abetting. There are precedents from prosecutions of companies complicit in apartheid and genocide. The Famine Declaration strengthens such legal claims by converting allegation into hard fact. Diplomatic reactions to the Famine Declaration demonstrate Israel's growing isolation, though. The United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary David Lammy called it a moral outrage and explicitly blamed Israel's refusal to allow adequate aid in. Well, what exactly have you done, Dave, except visit Israel more times than any other nation since you became Foreign Secretary, taken donations from the Israel lobby, be a Labour friend of Israel, keep signing off arms export licenses and refuse to stop sending parts for F-35. You, sunshine, can shut your hole. Your day in The Hague can't come soon enough. Others with far more credibility, though that isn't a high bar, I appreciate, did say similarly, though. The European Union's Humanitarian Commissioner stated that famine was not a risk but a reality. Ireland's Prime Minister declared that withholding food and water constitutes a war crime. Belgium's Deputy Prime Minister said famine was the consequence of deliberate political choices. Spain went further, denouncing an Israeli-induced famine. Jordan and the Gulf Cooperation Council accused Israel of using starvation as a deliberate policy tool. Even Jordan now, the nation equivalent to a shiver looking for a spine when it comes to Israel, have slammed this. Even allies such as Canada and Australia joined in pressing for unfettered humanitarian access. The United States adopted a more cautious line because you just knew they would, didn't you? Attempting to deflect blame towards Hamas. Well, get there before Israel does it, I suppose. Yet Washington could not deny famine itself. Trump himself has said as much, having seen the images of children. Even he could not deny it in recent weeks. So the US position now looks increasingly defensive and isolated, and rightly so if they are still going to try and shield Israel here even now. For Netanyahu, the political consequences are severe. His dismissal of the IPC finding as a blood libel isolates him from the language of international diplomacy and deepens the perception of denialism. It exposes him as the depraved and evil man we all know him to be. Within Israel, the famine fuels division. Many citizens reject the possibility that famine exists, while others fear their state is being branded as an international pariah. For Israel's narrative abroad, the famine is disastrous. The portrayal of a small democracy under siege collapses when set against evidence that it presides over the first officially declared famine outside Africa. That they have actually created this as well. It's man-made. The IPC declaration does not end with Israel, though. It's a point that matters and must be made clear. It places all enablers under scrutiny now. Governments supplying weapons to Israel, above all the US, the UK, Germany, they must now reckon with accusations of complicity in starvation. Israel literally threatened to raze Gaza City unless hostages were released at the very moment famine was declared there. So to continue arming such a government looks like aiding collective punishment. And you're all due a day in court if you don't stop now. Corporations face similar risks. Defence manufacturers and banks financing trade with Israel now operate under the shadow of famine complicity. The Famine Declaration empowers the BDS movement to argue that any financial or institutional ties with Israel amounts to support for war crimes. Universities, pension funds and churches already reviewing their investments now have the strongest possible justification to divest. Civil society groups are strengthened in their campaigns of direct action against arms factories and logistics hubs. Their claim that Israel's enablers are complicit in atrocity has been transformed from polemic to plausible legal argument. Diplomatic enablers also face consequences. Germany's government, which has positioned itself as Israel's most loyal ally in Europe, is increasingly exposed. Its insistence on unconditional support now appears morally untenable. Surely it must be. Fletcher's phrase that famine is sustained by complicity will haunt every state that persists in business as usual. To understand Gaza's famine fully, you need to set it against a history of famine denial as well. In 1943, for example, Britain denied its responsibility for the Bengal famine despite shipping grain away from starving populations. In the 1980s, Sudanese leaders denied famine in the Darfur region. We're seeing similar again today. The largest humanitarian crisis on earth is in South Sudan right now. While Ethiopia's government suppressed information during the Tigray famine. North Korea likewise concealed famine in the 1990s. In each case, denial delayed aid and deepened suffering. Israel now joins that ignoble lineage. But Gaza differs in two respects. First, this is happening in a modern urban environment under total surveillance. Drones watch every movement, satellites track aid convoys, yet famine still unfolds. Second, unlike earlier famines, this one occurs not in a fragile state, but under the authority of an occupying regional power with strong Western support. So the implications are very stark, they're very blatant. Famine is not the misfortune of weak states alone, but can be engineered by a state that claims democratic legitimacy and enjoys advanced military capacity. This is why Israel's denial has crumbled so spectacularly. We've never seen depravity on this scale before. Censorship failed, propaganda has collapsed, and complicity has been laid utterly bare and horrifying people across the globe. Israel has attempted to control the narrative by restricting press access and targeting journalists, but it hasn't worked. Foreign correspondents have been banned while local reporters have been killed or harassed. This censorship limited independent coverage, certainly. Yet in this digital age, it is impossible to conceal famine entirely. Social media leaks, testimony from aid workers, the reports from those brave journalists on the scene who gave their lives far too often, and satellite images of aid blocked at borders undermined every official narrative going. Propaganda played a key role in denial. Netanyahu's invocation of blood libel sought to portray famine allegations as anti-Semitic attacks because it is what he always does. One of the biggest dangers to Jewish diaspora on the planet, as he is because of it. This rhetorical strategy attempts to shield policy from scrutiny by conflating criticism of state action with bigotry. Yet the IPCC scientific assessment cuts through that propaganda because it is focused, because it is scientific, demonstrating that facts can puncture even the most aggressive narrative management. Israel's propaganda has not only failed, it has backfired, leaving the government exposed as both cruel and dishonest. The famine raises profound ethical questions now. If famine is preventable and deliberate, what obligations do other states now have to deal with it? Is it acceptable to treat famine as a tragedy to be mourned, or must it be treated as a crime to be stopped now? Supplying weapons to a government accused of starving civilians challenges the ethical foundations of arms export regimes. Silence or neutrality becomes indistinguishable from complicity now, doesn't it? The famine also forces a reframing of humanitarian discourse. For decades, famines were seen as natural disasters or failures of governance. Gaza shows famine as a weapon, intentionally inflicted. This shifts famine from the realm of humanitarian misfortune to the realm of war crimes and once again genocide. That change demands not only aid, but accountability. The Gaza famine also exposes systemic failures in global governance. The IPC warned in March and June that famine was imminent, yet no effective action followed. They were ignored. The UN Security Council remained paralysed by United States vetoes. Aid convoys were still obstructed at borders. Food still piled up metres away from starving families, and it just kept being allowed to happen over and over again. This failure undermines the credibility of the UN and of humanitarian law. If famine can be declared in 2025 and yet continue unabated, what does this say about the effectiveness of international institutions? The credibility of the Security Council was already in tatters. Now it is even more so. Calls for reform, particularly the abolition of veto powers in atrocity crimes, will grow louder. Gaza demonstrates that existing structures cannot prevent atrocity when powerful states keep on shielding the perpetrators. For Israel, the famine is a strategic disaster. It erodes alliances, empowers boycott movements, and collapses its narrative abroad. It strengthens Palestinian resistance and global solidarity, ensuring that Gaza's suffering becomes a rallying cry for generations. For allies, the famine raises the political cost of support. Governments in the US, the UK, and Germany now face electorates who see their taxes linked to images of starving children. Political leaders who persist in defending Israel risk electoral backlash and reputational damage. For the wider world, the Gaza famine needs to become a defining moment, akin to Sharpeville or Soweto in apartheid South Africa. Those massacres shifted global opinion decisively against apartheid. The famine may do the same for Israel's legitimacy. It'll be remembered as either a moment of complicity or a moment when the world finally acted. But what will follow? Because we can't be sure, can we? Will Israel face sanctions at last? We don't know. Will its allies be dragged into the dock alongside with it? They should be. Will the famine be reversed quickly now, or will it scar Gaza for generations to come? Again, a question we can't answer. These questions, unfortunately, still remain open. And the answers will determine not only the fate of Gaza, but the credibility of international law. What is it worth if this famine, man-made as it is allowed to continue after this report has come out? The famine declaration in Gaza needs to be a watershed moment. Before yesterday, famine could be denied or contested. Today, it's a certified fact. Before, Israel and its allies could equivocate. After, silence is complicity. Before, Israel can still portray itself as besieged. After, it stands accused as the architect of the first 21st century famine in an urban environment. The consequences are sweeping. Legally, the famine strengthens the case at the ICC and ICJ. Diplomatically, it accelerates Israel's isolation. Politically, it deepens Netanyahu's vulnerability and tarnishes his allies. Ethically, it confronts the world with the reality of deliberate starvation as a weapon of war. And strategically, it marks the collapse of Israel's narrative utterly, and the rise of global solidarity with Palestine must follow. Tom Fletcher's words encapsulate the moral weight of this situation. It is a famine caused by cruelty, justified by revenge, and enabled by indifference, sustained by complicity. A famine on all of our watch. The question his speech posed, what did you do, will haunt governments, corporations, and citizens alike, and it needs to. The Gaza famine is not only Israel's famine, it is the world's famine. What consequences Israel and its allies will ultimately face is now a question the world cannot ignore and needs to start answering. Meanwhile, as David Lammy makes another hand-wringing condemnatory response to Israeli atrocity, whilst of course doing absolutely nothing about it, the Starmer regime in the UK is set to hand a £2 billion defence contract to Israel's largest arms supplier, Elbit Systems. Coincidentally, right after they prescribed Palestine Action, who target Elbit sites in the UK, of course. Surely those two things can't be connected in some way, can they? Well, check out this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch and see what you think. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.